So Module 6 is now continuing on with our education, and we've been talking about the various aspects of schooling, and what we're going to focus on in this module is how children learn to read through things like the alphabetic principle, and then factors that make up effective schools. So let's go ahead and first launch into one of the more important skills for children to learn in elementary school, and that's learning how to read. And of course, this doesn't occur overnight or out of the blue. You have to have several things in place for them to eventually learn how to read. And so the first concept is the alphabetic principle, and that's the idea that the letters in printed words represent the sounds coming out of our mouth in some sort of systematic way. So those little squigglies that you see printed on the page, or what you're staring at right now, actually correlate with or correspond with the words coming out of my mouth. And you have to realize the link between those two, obviously, before you're going to be able to learn how to read. So printed words are related to sounds. Now, there are various phases of this alphabetic principle that will eventually lead to reading. And the first of those phases is the pre-alphabetic. And this is where children begin to memorize visual cues to remember words. And so it may be the look of it. So eventually, if they've seen enough of a word over and over again, they may just see the general form. But there's also other sorts of things that need to be in place. For example, they have to understand that you go from left to right, that you go down a page. So left to right and down, that's how we read. And so sometimes it helps when you're reading with a child to use your finger to show where you're going. And the cutest thing is when children believe they can read too, and they start to mimic the same thing very early on. So that's the pre-alphabetic phase. And you just want to get them used to even how do you open up a book. That's a pretty advanced kind of thing to realize. The partial alphabetic phase, what you learn here are the shapes and sounds of letters. You see a lot of that, a little bit in pre-K, definitely in kindergarten. You're seeing the full partial alphabetic phase in effect there, where I remember growing up myself, they would have little blow-up dolls of each of the letters, and apple is ah, 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 ah. Okay, that's a partial alphabetic kind of learning where you correspond the sounds with the actual letters. Okay, so once you get that down, you now get into the full alphabetic phase. And in the full alphabetic phase, you know all the letters, and now you're making the connections between written letters and the corresponding sounds on top of it. So partial alphabetic, you start that phase. Full alphabetic is when you've mastered all of those letters. And that is where you begin to see that phonological awareness, that decoding that we talked about in earlier modules in language, comes into the forefront with learning how to read. And then finally, you have your consolidated alphabetic phase. This is where you begin to group letters that regularly occur together into a unit. So, for example, like ing, or the ing word, the sh, the th, sh. Those are the types of things. And of course, once you start grouping letters, consolidating that alphabetic, then it's not a huge step to start being able to say real words. So like the word she, sh is sh, and e is e. So she. Okay, so there you go. And that is the phases that you eventually get to being able to read. Now, you're not quite there yet. You just have the building blocks. There are some other things that need to be in place. And so emergent literacy, what this is the developmental precursors of actual reading skills in young children. And that includes the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are going to facilitate the acquisition of reading ability. So the alphabetic principle is very important. Obviously, you're not going to be able to read without it. But there's other things that you need to do. And these are the things I was telling you about in that pre-alphabetic phase that you want to try to prepare children for. So one of the big things is to read the preschoolers. that is the best thing to do. Well, even younger, but preschoolers are going to be particularly receptive because their cognitive maturation has finally got to the point where they're going to be able to read. So you don't have to obviously drill them in can they read, but rather just reading to them. Lots of good picture books. One of the things that are really good for preschoolers is repetitious reading and rhyme. So this is the time where preschoolers want a story read to them over, over, over again. And the poor adults usually have it more than memorized and don't want to go ahead and read one more time of Strawberry Shortcake, which if and when you have children, please do not select Strawberry Shortcake because you can have a very good time only so often. I highly recommend things like Dr. Seuss or other kind of rhyming sort of books. They're a lot more fun. And if you haven't read a rhyming book, I gotta say it is a lot more fun than it should be. I really got a kick out of reading a lot of the rhyming books, not just Dr. Seuss, but there's a lot of other really good ones out there. And just the feel on your tongue as the rhymes go and everything, it's just really, really pleasant. So if you have a chance to read to a young child, I certainly encourage you to do it. It's rewarding and it's very helpful for them too. It's just a great bonding activity. Next is questions. You want to go ahead and ask questions and make sure they understand what's going on. Of course, if they've read it very frequently, they're going to go ahead and have good reading. Good knowledge of what's going to be coming. So when you ask questions, it shouldn't be very hard for them to answer effectively. And that's really encouraging comprehension. What you're doing is, look, not only are we reading these stories, and that you have these good ideas of the alphabetic principle, but we want to understand beyond that, not just reading the words, which is challenging, but to read the words and then understand the overall meaning. And the only way you get to that is asking questions of them like, what's going to happen next? Or do you trust this evil step witch? No, I don't. Okay, so these are the types of questions and call and response to that. That's really good. Don't let the pigeon drive the bus. I really like because there's a whole kind of questioning built in as the pigeon tries to convince you to drive the bus, which I will say is just a very bad idea if you haven't read the book yourself. Though I encourage you to do that. It'll take you all of 5 minutes if it's a cute book. Okay, so now there is a question of what happens when reading goes wrong. This is referred to as dyslexia. It could also be referred to as a reading disability. Dyslexia is a reading disability. It depends on how you define it, on whether it's a specific form of reading disability or if it's just reading disabilities in general. But what it really is, they think that there's an underlying auditory perceptual problem that doesn't allow them to have the correct phonological awareness. In other words, they're not able to segregate those phonemes effectively, and so that throws off their reading when they eventually learn to read. So they really tend to perform poorly, children with dyslexia, on phonological awareness and word recognition. And there are a lot of effective reading interventions. There's the Orton-Gillingham and Barton approaches that are particularly good, but obviously, that does make it a much more challenging experience to be in school because starting around third grade, reading transitions from a topic itself to an expectation. So you got to read in science, you got to read in social studies, got to read in English, got to read in almost all of your areas. Other than in even math, actually, you need to read. And so somebody that has dyslexia, a lot of times will see poor school performance across the board, even though it's a reading disability and not necessarily an intellectual one. So let's go ahead and fast forward a little bit and think about, once you've learned to read and that you're in schools, what make effective schools? What are factors that matter? And this was, especially in the early 2000s, a real area of debate because what they wanted to do is lower the teacher to student ratio, believing that the more adults that were around children for one-on-one time, for small groups, the more effective your overall academics were going to be. So they spent millions of dollars, especially in early elementary, closing or lowering the class size. And what they found is that really it didn't help. It didn't help. The difference between a class of 20 and a class of 25 just wasn't enough to warrant the extra cost of the teachers, and that the children learned basically about at the same level. So that really spurred the debate, well, what matters? What really matters in having an effective school? Now, this first one's not going to surprise you, and that is student aptitude. In other words, having highly qualified students that want to learn, that's effective school. So a lot of times we can't choose in the public schools what our students' aptitude is, though you do tend to see in the more affluent areas a higher level of student aptitude because of the various economic advantages that brings. Having high expectations. And so things like having a strong emphasis on academics and expecting individuals to be able to achieve at this higher level and holding people up to that. So, in other words, you give them a goal to reach for. Task-oriented classes and environments. So the less distractions you have, the more learning occurs. There's a big correlation to the more attention that you pay to something, the more you're going to learn it. And we should know that, right? Because we went ahead and talked about the information processing approach, and that attention drives everything. So the more time you spend on a topic, the more likely it's going to get into that long-term memory and that you're going to be effective in learning the material. The more distractions, the worse off you are. So to that point, you want to go ahead and manage discipline effectively. So if you have a good, effective discipline where you go ahead and make a set of rules and those rules are enforced on a regular basis and everybody has that structure, they tend to do much better and there is more task orientation and therefore higher achievement. And then, of course, you want to have some sort of atmosphere of social cohesion. So every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, which used to be the old No Child Left Behind, has a whole section of the federal law now that emphasizes the school climate. And they find that the better the school climate, the more connected an individual feels to that school, usually the more effort they put towards it. And so there's a lot to be said for that kind of atmosphere of social cohesion and what it really helps in the long run as far as individuals learning. Now, all of this being said, the key for it all is a goodness of fit between the student and the school. So it's really the secret in finding that match. And so particularly in high schools where they have like magnet schools and such, you could have a child that's pretty smart but very artistic and kind of creative, and then they get put into like this cutting edge STEM kind of high school when really they need to be in the performing arts high school. And even though they have the capability, it's not a good fit for them because they want to be in the more performing arts school, even if it's maybe a little more run down. They will have a better fit there. And so trying to find that. Of course, we usually don't have that much flexibility. There aren't magnet schools in a lot of the schools that you all attended. So it could be little sub areas that there's a real emphasis in that a child and a student can really get into so that they're fully able to blossom. Okay, so that's the kind of main areas in regards to effective schools. Next, we're going to tackle adolescence in school and some of the factors going on there in Module 7. So stay tuned.